My summer vacation was a horrifying nightmare. The plan had been simple, a 2-week retreat at a rented cabin deep in the heart of the Neversink Woods, a sprawling, dense forest known for its untouched beauty and miles of serene trails. Our group, consisting of me, Ben, Tara, Sophie, and Alex, had been looking forward to this getaway for months. Eager to escape the city's bustle, we packed our bags with essentials and excitement, completely unaware of the horrors that awaited us. Our journey began under the cheerful summer sun, with sing-alongs and stories filling our drive up to the cabin. But as we ventured deeper into the forest, the canopy of trees thickened, swallowing our vehicle in a tunnel of shadows. The deeper we drove, the more the outside world seemed to slip away, leaving us in a bubble of eerie stillness, punctuated only by the occasional bird call. Upon arrival, the cabin looked like it had leapt straight out of a postcard. Made of weathered logs, it stood against a backdrop of towering pines, its windows peering out like watchful eyes. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and earth, and for a moment, all our worries seemed trivial. The first few days passed without incident. We hiked the surrounding trails, cooked meals over an open fire, and shared stories under the stars. However, the peace was short-lived. On the fourth night, as the wind howled outside and the fire crackled in the hearth, Sophie, who had been quiet for most of the evening, finally spoke up. "Did you guys hear about the legend of Neversink Woods?" she asked, her voice tinged with a mix of curiosity and fear. We shook our heads, suddenly attentive. "They say these woods are haunted by their Neversink witch, a woman who lived here over a century ago. Villagers accused her of witchcraft after a series of unexplained deaths and misfortunes. They executed her, right where our cabin stands," Sophie continued, her eyes wide with the flickering firelight reflecting off her face. Her story chilled our bones, but we dismissed it as just that, a story. Yet, that night, as the wind screamed like the anguished wails of a tormented soul, our skepticism began to waver. The first signs of something amiss came with small, inexplicable occurrences. Items would move on their own, doors would slam shut without a draft. Then the dreams started. Every one of us experienced vivid, terrifying nightmares that left us waking in a cold sweat. In these dreams, a shadowy figure, cloaked in black, would stand at the foot of our beds, whispering in a language we couldn't understand. Despite these horrors, we decided to stay, attributing our experiences to the power of suggestion from Sophie's tale. But as the days progressed, so did the intensity of the occurrences. It culminated on the 7th night, a night that would forever be etched in my memory. We had all settled into bed, the unease from the previous nights hanging heavy in the air. Just as sleep began to claim me, a piercing scream shattered the silence. It was Tara. I bolted upright and rushed to her room, the others close behind. We found her on the floor, her body curled up, shaking uncontrollably, her eyes wide with fear. She was here. The witch was here, she shrieked, pointing to the now closed window. Rushing to the window, I expected to see nothing but the dark woods. However, to my horror, there, etched into the frost on the glass, was the unmistakable outline of a hand with fingers too long, too twisted to be human. As we huddled together, the realization dawned on us, the Neversink witch was more than just a legend, and our presence had awakened her malevolent spirit. Now, with each passing moment, her grip on our sanity tightened, drawing us further into a nightmare that we had unwittingly become a part of. The chilling revelation that the Neversink witch was more than mere folklore terrified us to our core. We spent the rest of the night huddled together in the living room, too afraid to separate or venture into the dark corridors of the cabin. Every creak and groan of the old wooden structure sent shivers down our spines, and the storm outside seemed to rage with renewed fury, as if echoing our own turmoil. As dawn broke, the storm had subsided, but the heavy air of dread remained. We debated leaving immediately, but Alex, the most rational among us, argued against it. If we leave now, in this state of panic, we might have an accident on the forest roads. Let's wait until daylight strengthens, gather our things calmly, and make a plan, he suggested. Reluctantly, we agreed. But as we moved around the cabin, packing up our belongings, the atmosphere felt oppressive, as though we were being watched by unseen eyes. Shadows seemed to move just at the periphery of our vision, and every sound was magnified, keeping us on edge. The decision to leave couldn't come soon enough, and as we loaded the last of our bags into the car, a dense fog rolled in from the woods, enveloping the cabin. It felt as if the forest itself was reluctant to let us leave, wrapping its cold fingers around us, blurring our vision and dampening our spirits. The drive out of the forest was tense, each of us silent, lost in our thoughts, jumping at the slightest sound. The fog was thick, reducing our world to the few meters of gravel road illuminated by the car's headlights. Suddenly, Sophie gasped, pointing shakily towards the front window. "Look! On the road!" Before us, a dark figure loomed. It was a woman, her dress tattered, her hair wild and unruly, obscuring her face. Then slammed on the brakes, barely stopping in time. The figure looked up slowly, and where her face should have been was nothing but a dark void, an abyss that seemed to pull at our very souls. Frozen in fear, we could only stare as she slowly, deliberately, walked towards the side of the road and disappeared into the woods, leaving us in stunned silence. "Was that?" Tara began, but no one answered. We knew, without saying, that it had been the witch. The encounter left us shaken, and we drove out of Neversink Woods in silence, each mile taking us further from the nightmare, yet doing nothing to ease the heaviness in our hearts. Back in the city, we tried to resume our normal lives, but the shadows of that week lingered. We spoke little of it, as if mentioning it might bring the horror back into our lives. But it was clear we were all struggling. Sleepless nights, jumpiness, and an overwhelming sense of paranoia became our new normal. One evening, about a week after our return, I received a call from Sophie. She was hysterical, crying so hard I could barely understand her words. "It's here," she managed to choke out. "The witch in my apartment. I saw her." I rushed over to her place, my heart pounding in my chest. When I arrived, Sophie was curled up in a corner of her living room, her eyes wide with terror. She told me that she had seen the witch standing in her bedroom, watching her as she slept. This was the last straw. We could not continue like this, tormented by something we didn't fully understand. We decided to meet the next day, all 5 of us, to discuss what to do. We needed answers, and it was clear we wouldn't find them by running or hiding. The next day, we gathered at a local cafe, a public place where we felt somewhat safer. Over coffee, we pored over old maps of Neversink Woods and dug through online articles, looking for anything that might tell us more about the witch and how to possibly rid ourselves of her curse. It was Alex who found the breakthrough, a blog post by a local historian, which detailed the lore of the Neversink witch. According to the post, the witch, before her execution, had cursed the villagers that they and their descendants would be haunted until her name was cleared and her innocence proven. "We have to go back," Alex said, determination in his voice. "We have to find her remains, give her a proper burial. It's the only way." The idea of returning to that place of horror was daunting, but it seemed we had no choice. Preparing ourselves as best we could, we planned our return to Neversink Woods. Little did we know, the true horror was yet to come, as the forest had more secrets to reveal, and the witch was not the only darkness dwelling within its depths. With the decision made to return to Neversink Woods, the following days were a blur of preparation and dread. Each of us dealt with the looming journey in our own way. Ben and Tara gathered supplies, insisting on being prepared for any physical threat. Sophie, still shaken from her encounter, delved deeper into the lore surrounding the witch, hoping to find something that might give us an edge. Alex coordinated our plans, mapping out our route to ensure we wouldn't get lost as we had before. I spent my time gathering information on protective rituals and symbols, even if it was just folklore, any potential shield felt necessary. As the day of our departure arrived, the weather seemed to reflect our mood, grey skies and a persistent drizzle that turned the roads slick and the air chill. The drive back was quiet, each of us lost in our thoughts, the only sound the steady swish of the windshield wipers and the hum of the tires on the wet asphalt. Arriving at the edge of Neversink Woods, the forest seemed to stare back at us, its trees like silent sentinels guarding the dark secrets within. The air was thick with mist, and a cold wind whispered through the branches, a ghostly greeting as we stepped out of the car. "We stick together, no matter what," Ben said, his voice firm, trying to mask the fear that we all felt. We nodded, our agreement binding us together. Armed with flashlights, a GPS, and a determination to end our nightmare, we entered the woods. The forest was oppressively silent, the usual sounds of wildlife eerily absent. The only noise was the crunch of our boots on the damp leaves and the occasional distant crack of a branch, a sound that made us stop and listen, hearts pounding, each time it occurred. As we ventured deeper, the fog thickened, swirling around us like cold fingers pulling us further in. After several hours of trekking, we arrived at the old site where the cabin had stood. Nothing remained now but a few charred timbers and overgrown foundations. It was here, according to the historian's blog, that the witch had been executed and unceremoniously buried in an unmarked grave. "We need to find her remains," Alex said, scanning the area with his flashlight. "They should be nearby." The task was grim, and as we began to search, the atmosphere tensed further. Every shadow seemed to move just out of the corner of our eyes, and several times, Tara thought she heard whispering coming from the trees. "It's like they are speaking," she murmured, her voice barely audible. As night began to fall, we found what we were looking for, a shallow depression in the earth covered with rotting leaves and vines. The ground was soft, and as we dug, a sense of urgency overcame us. We needed to finish this before complete darkness enveloped us. Finally, our shovels clinked against something hard. Clearing the mud and leaves, we uncovered a rough wooden coffin, decayed and partially broken. Lifting the lid, we were met with the sight of skeletal remains, the bones fragile and stained with the passage of time. A sense of sorrow washed over us, the tragedy of the witch's fate more real now than ever. "We need to perform the ritual," I said, pulling out the items I had gathered, a circle of salt, sage for burning, and a small, handwritten plea for forgiveness that we had all signed. We hoped these offerings would appease her spirit. As we set up the ritual, the wind picked up, howling through the trees like the cries of the damned. The air grew colder, and a palpable dread settled over us. We lit the sage, the smoke twisting and turning in the air, and began to recite the words we had prepared. But as we did, the ground beneath us trembled, and a low moan echoed through the forest, growing louder, turning into a cacophony of screams. Panic set in, and we clung to each other, watching as shadows began to coalesce around us, forming into the shape of the witch, her presence overwhelming and furious. "Leave!" The voice was a thunderous roar, filled with anger and pain. We backed away, stumbling in our haste, the ritual forgotten in our fear. The witch's form grew larger, the shadows enveloping us, suffocating. It seemed as though the forest itself was alive, angry and vengeful. Just when it seemed like the darkness would swallow us whole, a sharp, piercing light cut through the night. It was the rising sun, its rays like blades slicing through the shadows. The witch's form wavered, the darkness receding reluctantly as the light grew stronger. Breathing heavily, we watched as the apparition faded, the forest slowly returning to normal. But the respite was temporary. We knew the witch had not been vanquished, only held at bay. As we hastily gathered our scattered supplies, the air still thrummed with a residual energy, a silent threat that lingered like the mist. We knew that our incomplete ritual had not resolved the curse. If anything, we had provoked the wrath of something ancient and powerful, bound to the soil of these haunted woods. Despite the daylight strengthening around us, a palpable darkness clung to the trees, as if the light could not fully penetrate the depths of the forest's heart. We hurried out of the clearing, casting nervous glances behind us, the feeling of being watched never fully dissipating. The trek back was fraught with tension. Every rustle in the underbrush, every snap of a twig spun us around, flashlights darting through the trees, expecting at any moment to see her, the witch, emerging from the shadows. But nothing appeared. The forest remained deceptively peaceful, its silence now as unnerving as any ghostly apparition. By the time we reached the car, we were exhausted, both physically and emotionally. The drive back to civilization was quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts, processing the night's terrifying events and the looming uncertainty of what we had unleashed. Once back in the safety of our own homes, the true impact of our ordeal began to sink in. That night, as I tried to find solace in the familiar surroundings of my room, the shadows seemed to flicker unnervingly. Sleep was elusive, and when it finally came, it brought no peace, only nightmares that replayed our encounter over and over, each time revealing more menacing details. The days that followed were no better. Reports began to surface online, stories from other hikers, locals living near the woods, even tourists who visited the area. They spoke of strange occurrences, eerie sightings, and a palpable sense of dread that seemed to have settled over Neversink woods. It was clear that our actions had disturbed something that could not be easily appeased. Determined to find a resolution, I reached out to a local historian who specialized in the region's folklore. Dr. Hammond was a retired university professor who had spent years documenting the legends and tales of Neversink woods. After hearing our story, he agreed to meet, his interest piqued by the mention of the witch. We met at a small cafe, the walls lined with books and local artifacts, creating a cozy, if somewhat cluttered, atmosphere. Dr. Hammond was an elderly man, his eyes bright with curiosity beneath bushy, graying eyebrows. "Your encounter is not unique," he began, sipping his tea thoughtfully. "The woods have always been a source of mystery. The legend of the witch, however, is particularly potent. It's a tale that has persisted for generations, woven into the fabric of local history." He paused, his gaze intense. "You said you attempted a ritual to appease her spirit. Tell me, what exactly did you do?" We explained, in detail, our actions and the incomplete ritual. Dr. Hammond listened intently, nodding occasionally, his expression growing increasingly grave. "It seems you've only scratched the surface," he said finally. "The witch's spirit is bound to the land, her rage fueled by centuries of betrayal and suffering. To truly resolve this, you'll need to understand her story, find out what she wants, and complete what you started, but with greater knowledge and preparation." The idea of returning to those cursed woods was daunting, but Dr. Hammond's words resonated with a harsh truth. The witch was not merely a spectre to be banished with simple rituals, she was a force intertwined with the history of Neversink itself. "In the meantime," Dr. Hammond continued, "I suggest you keep yourself safe. There are symbols, old protections that can ward off spirits. I'll give you some references." He handed us a small, leather-bound book filled with sketches and notes on various protective symbols and rituals. "This might help shield you, at least temporarily." That night, after our meeting, I pored over the book, tracing the intricate symbols, memorizing the ancient words. The task was daunting, but the fear of what might happen if we failed was a powerful motivator. As days turned into weeks, each of us took measures to protect ourselves, drawing symbols on our doorways, carrying talismans as described in Dr. Hammond's book. The nightmares lessened, the oppressive feeling of being watched gradually subsided, but the weight of our responsibility never did. We knew we had to return to Neversink woods. The witch's story needed to be uncovered, her pain acknowledged and appeased. Only then could we hope to end the nightmare that we had unwittingly stepped into. Woods seemed more sentient than ever, as if gathering their forces against our impending intrusion. As the time for our return approached, the atmosphere among us grew increasingly tense. Each conversation, each planning session was shadowed by the unspoken fear of what awaited us. We knew that this time, our journey into the heart of Neversink Woods needed to be more than just a search for closure. It was a mission to right a wrong that had festered like an open wound in the land's history. With Dr. Hammond's guidance, we prepared meticulously. He had advised us to not only focus on protective measures, but also on understanding the historical context of the witch's life and death. According to his research, the woman known as the Neversink Witch was once called Mary Bethany, a healer and midwife, ostracized for her knowledge of herbal remedies and midwifery, which the townsfolk had superstitiously linked to witchcraft. Understanding her life, vindicating her name, might be key to appeasing her spirit, Dr. Hammond had suggested. It's not uncommon for spirits tied to trauma to seek resolution, not just through rituals but through the restoration of their truth. Equipped with old maps, historical documents, and a renewed sense of purpose, we set out once again to Neversink Woods. The sky was overcast, a blanket of grey that seemed to press down upon us as we approached the forest's edge. The woods welcomed us with a silence that was almost deafening, the absence of natural sounds creating a vacuum that seemed to pull at our very breaths. As we walked the familiar paths, the air grew colder, the shadows deeper. We were not merely intruders this time, we were bearers of truth seeking redemption, not just for ourselves but for Mary Bethany. The deeper we ventured, the more palpable her presence felt. Whispers filled the air, rustling through the leaves like murmurs of the past, and several times, fleeting visions of a woman's figure flitted at the edge of our vision, her gaze lingering with a mixture of curiosity and sorrow. Nightfall found us at the old site of Mary's execution and burial. With no time to lose and the darkness deepening, we began our ritual anew. This time, however, we included an element Dr. Hammond had insisted upon, a recitation of Mary's story, spoken aloud to the listening woods. Mary Bethany, I began, my voice steady but echoing strangely in the quiet forest, was a healer, a woman of knowledge, who aided many in their time of need. Her life was not one of darkness but of service, unjustly ended by fear and ignorance. As I spoke, the air around us shifted, the atmosphere thickening. Shadows seemed to coalesce, forming a dense circle around us, pressing in with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. But we persisted, recounting Mary's life, her contributions to the community, her brutal and unjust death. With each word, the oppressive air seemed to pulse, reacting, listening. When the last of her story was told, we placed upon her grave a wreath of wildflowers, symbols of life and healing, and a written decree proclaiming her innocence, signed by each of us, witnessed by the encroaching night. The moment the decree touched the soil, a wind swept through the clearing, fierce and cleansing. The shadows recoiled, then surged forward, swirling around the grave, around us, faster and faster, creating a vortex of air and spirit. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. In the sudden stillness that followed, a figure materialized before us. It was Mary, her appearance no longer shrouded in the garb of a witch, but as a woman of gentle countenance, her eyes filled with tears but also relief. Thank you, her voice was a whisper, yet it resonated deeply, filled with centuries of pain and gratitude. She stepped forward, her form becoming less defined, merging with the night air, with the essence of the forest itself. As her figure dissipated, a lightness filled the air, as if a great weight had been lifted from the woods. The night sounds returned, frogs croaking, an owl hooting, a chorus of life reclaiming the space. We stood in silence, absorbing the profound change in the atmosphere, the peace that seemed to blanket the forest. But our relief was tinged with caution, an understanding that while we might have appeased one spirit, the history of Neversink Woods was long and complex. Other secrets, other shadows might yet lurk in its depths, waiting for their own stories to be told, their own truths to be revealed. As we made our way back through the now whispering trees, a subtle understanding settled among us. Our journey with Neversink was far from over. This night had been a step towards reconciliation, a chapter in a larger story still unfolding, a tale woven into the very fabric of these ancient woods. As we exited the forest, the first rays of dawn were breaking across the horizon, casting a golden glow that seemed to bless our departure. The sense of dread that had accompanied our entrance was now replaced by a cautious hope. We had faced the horrors of the past, had spoken for those wronged, and in doing so, found a measure of peace. But the relief was complex, interwoven with the knowledge that Neversink Woods held more than just the story of Mary Bethany. The drive back home was quiet, each of us lost in contemplation. We had come into the woods burdened by fear and curiosity, and we left with a deeper understanding not only of the supernatural but of the power of history and the weight of injustice. In the weeks that followed, our lives slowly returned to normal, but the experience remained with us, a quiet current in the back of our minds. We kept in touch with Dr. Hammond, who continued to guide us through the historical nuances of the region. It seemed that with each layer of history we uncovered, the more the mystery of Neversink Woods deepened. Months passed, and the events of that night became a shared memory, a ghost story of our own that we sometimes recounted to disbelieving friends. But for us, the story was all too real, a reminder of the thin veil between the known and the unknown. Then, one autumn evening, as the leaves began to turn and the air grew crisp with the promise of winter, I received a call from Alex. His voice was urgent, tinged with excitement and an undercurrent of fear. "You need to see this," he said, directing me to an online forum where hikers shared stories of their encounters in various wilderness areas. A new post had appeared, titled "Voices in Neversink Woods." The author recounted an experience eerily similar to our own, of whispers in the dark and a shadowy figure watching from a distance. But there was something more, an invitation, a plea from the woods for its secrets to be uncovered. I shared the post with the rest of the group. The decision was unspoken but unanimous. We knew what we had to do. Neversink Woods was calling us back, not out of malice, but out of a need for its stories to be heard. It seemed our role in the woods tale was not yet finished. So, as the story of one nightmare ended, another chapter beckoned, promising deeper dives into the shadowed realms of history and spirit. We had learned that some mysteries don't yearn for solace, instead, they invite you deeper into their embrace, offering both revelation and more enigmas. 11 As I packed my bag for our return to Neversink, I couldn't help but feel that we were stepping into a larger narrative, one that transcended our own experiences. The woods awaited, not just as a place of past horrors, but as a keeper of stories, each one waiting to be told, each one a thread in the vast, intricate tapestry of the unknown. And so, with a mix of trepidation and resolve, we set out once again, heading into the whispering darkness of Neversink Woods, where the past was alive, and every shadow held a story.